And we also have with us today Annie Watson, an assistant professor of political science at Middle Georgia State University, and also happens to be one of our research fellows on women and children's rights. And Annie is here to speak with us about our people at risk and qualitative data. Annie, can you tell us a little about the global trends that emerge from people at risk data for economic and social rights?
Absolutely. So when it comes to our quality of life, differences in enjoyment of rights or perceptions of this enjoyment rely less on what people do, their occupations, their political activities, and more on personal characteristics like what they look like, who their families are, where they live, and how they move through society. If I had to pick one group that is most commonly associated with increased risks of human rights violations, though, I would pick homelessness. Either people experiencing homelessness generally or youths experiencing homelessness in particular, or both, had or shared with other identities the highest perception of risk for the right to work in 20% of the countries we surveyed, the right to health in 25% of countries, the right to education in 35%, food in 40%, and housing in more than 50% of countries. And in between 83 and 90% of our countries, depending on the right, at least one respondent identified one of these groups as being at risk. And this makes sense. People experiencing homelessness are, by definition, not enjoying their right to stable, secure housing. Without housing, it's also very difficult to store food, especially perishables, or prepare for job interviews or do homework. Any personal property you have may be at risk. Your physical safety may be at risk. It can have devastating effects on every area of someone's life. The category with the second highest perception of risk across rights in countries is people with low social or economic status, and the immigrant, people with disabilities, indigenous peoples, and everyone categories are right behind them.
Annie, can you give us an example of a country that meets exactly this trend you just described to us?
So China, one of the new countries for our survey this year, is a great example. People experiencing homelessness, youths experiencing homelessness, and people with low social or economic status had the highest perceptions of risk for 4 of the 5 rights: food, education, health, and housing. At least 50% and as many as 73% of our respondents saw these groups as being at risk for abuses of these rights. Our qualitative data also add some very useful context for these experiences. The lack of regulations for unhealthy foods, ineffective safety laws, and lax enforcement of regulations mean that everyone except for powerful political figures struggle with food safety, to the point that in some cases it leads to medical concerns. Extremely high medical costs limit access to healthcare for all but the very wealthy, which would make it difficult to address those and other medical concerns. And high prices and state-controlled housing markets make purchasing a home all but impossible. When we look at education, we see that schools in rural areas, which are also likely to demonstrate higher poverty rates, they're often closed down. Where they are open, girls are less likely to be able to access them, and materials are often not offered in appropriate languages for different ethnic groups, including Uyghurs, Mongolians, and Tibetans. Special needs education institutions are also very expensive, which makes them inaccessible for children with disabilities who don't come from wealthy families. I have to note, though, that while we do see greater numbers of respondents identifying certain groups as being at risk, every category we offer on the survey was chosen at least once, all 39, which means that ultimately anyone without wealth and significant political power is at risk of having their rights violated in China.
And are there any countries where this global trend don't hold true?
Venezuela is one case that comes to mind. Here, the all people category is either the top or one of the top categories for all 5 quality of life rights, with as many as 88% of our respondents identifying everyone in the country as being at risk, in this case for the right to work. This is a function of the economic crises, the corruption, and the violence that have plagued the country since the late 2000s. No one's safe from that. India also shows some interesting deviations from the global trends. While we do still see the big 3 I named before, people experiencing homelessness, youths experiencing homelessness, and people with low social or economic status having high perceptions of risk, they're joined by other groups in those top 3 risk categories, particularly migrants and immigrants, indigenous peoples, and people from particular cultural backgrounds or castes. We see concerns about Adivasis, who are indigenous peoples in India, members of castes such as the Dalits, particularly women, and members of denotified and nomadic tribes, especially those living in Bihar, highlighted across all 5 rights in our qualitative data.
And what does it mean for people who aren't identified by respondents as being at risk? Does it mean by any chance that their rights aren't at risk?
Not at all. Like Minna mentioned before, we like to look at our people at risk data as more of a floor, not a ceiling. The groups that respondents identify as being particularly at risk are the ones that they're thinking about in the moment. If we were able to prod them to think about specific examples, it's likely they could identify ways in which those groups are at risk as well. So a group being identified by respondents means that their rights are definitely at risk. But groups who aren't identified may still be at risk as well. Additionally, we have to remember that these data are strictly focused on 2021, which means they don't necessarily reflect abuses that are happening right now. That means that our people at risk data for the right to health in the United States, for example, don't reflect the fact that the Supreme Court just gutted the national level protections for abortion. There is no mention of abortion in the qualitative data, and only 14% of our respondents identified women and girls' right to health as being at risk. We'll have to wait for next year's surveys to see the incorporation of recent events like these.
And is there a particular group whose people at risk results stood out or surprised you in any kind of way?
My counterpart, Liz Koletsky, and I are working on initiating HRMI's child rights workstream, and we were particularly struck by the responses about children. In this year's survey, respondents from 38 countries identified children as being at risk of experiencing violations of at least one right. And of the 13 rights covered by the people at risk data, there was only one right that our respondents didn't identify as at risk for children in at least some of our countries, and that was freedom from death penalty executions. On the whole, though, rates of respondents identifying children as being at risk are relatively low. Where they do identify children as being at risk, more respondents are likely to focus on the quality of life rights. So education is the category of one of the categories with the highest perception of risk for 17 countries, nearly half. Food is right behind it with 14 countries, but it's really rare to see the empowerment rights show up. Assembly and political participation only have or share the highest perception of risk for children in 2 countries in our data. And yet we know it's incredibly rare to see governments allow children to vote, and institutions like children's parliaments, where they exist, are often very limited. This kind of gap is reflective of the more general approach to children's rights around the world. We know a lot more and have a lot more data on children's rights to health and education, but information about civil and political rights is a lot more limited. Liz and I, along with Oliver Fiala at Save the Children, also have a post on ECPR's political science blog, The Loop, coming out next month. In it, we discuss the dramatically different experiences that children have based on other identities they hold, gender, wealth, location, and so on. If anyone listening is particularly interested in children's rights, I encourage you to keep an eye out for that post. And Liz and I would also love to hear from you as we work with our contacts at international children's rights organizations and other stakeholders to create our framework for measuring children's rights here at HRMI.
Thanks, Annie, and looking forward to read the post you mentioned.